Figma has released some fire features this year, and I know you probably feel like it's challenging to keep up. It's like the more stuff they release, the harder things get. But don't worry, I've got you covered. In today's video, I'll go through step by step how you should use Figma's component properties and auto layout to create the most comprehensive card component you have ever seen. Let's go. We'll start by going over the four main types of component properties, the most fundamental first, and then we advance as we move along. Let me give you guys a quick walkthrough of how this file is structured so you can follow along. On the left hand side, we have a bunch of different examples. On the right hand side is the space that we're going to create or recreate these examples. And the first segment of the video is going to cover the main component property features that were launched earlier this year. And then in the very end of the video, we're going to cover the beta features that were launched last month during September. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's dig into it. So the very first example here, we have a card variant. So we're using the component property called variant. And basically what it means is that we have two different properties or two different variations of a component, which is available here on the right hand panel. So if we take one of these components, we look on the right hand side, we find two types. First one called 1, the second one called 2. And the main difference between the two is that the image is placed, or the image placeholder is placed either horizontally or vertically stacked. That's basically it. So let's recreate this on the right hand side. I'll make a copy of this, paste it right here so we can have a look at the structure. Digging into the layers, we can see that we have an image placeholder, just a rectangle shape at the top. Then we have a content section with all of the text layers, and then a CTA row or a button row at the bottom with an auto layout button frame. That's pretty much it. So let's recreate this with the same values and everything. So we have the image layer 158. Let's call this image. And then we have all of these things. So I'll just make a copy of the text styles so I don't have to recreate them. Let's keep 8 pixel distance between the two. And for the button, I have pre-created a couple of button assets that I have stored in a separate page called button components, and it's basically just an auto layout frame with a text and a colored background or an outlined background. And this is going to come handy later in this video. So let's just reuse that instead of creating a new one. So let's find that from local components, button components, and then let's use the outline button. I will wrap this button inside of a frame with 0 pixel margin and padding. Let's make sure that it's aligned to the right. Let's call this button row. These two, we can place them in an auto layout frame as well and rename it to text content. So we have button row, text content. Let's place both of these together, nest them inside of a parent frame called content. So when we open it up, we have text content at the top, button row at the bottom. Let's make sure all of the values are set correctly. So the spacing between these two, I want it to be set at 24 pixels. And then let's make sure that everything just fills the container. We want to make sure that everything is responsive as well. So let's dig into the child components and make sure that those values are correct as well. Once you update some of it, it might readjust or reset. So it's important to just make sure that each and every child object has the correct setting. Seems like we are good to go. All right, yep, this seems to be good. And we have a 24 pixel padding at the top, 24 at the bottom, 12 on each side. So let's make sure that we have the same values here. 24 top and bottom, 12 on each side. This is fixed, which is cool. This fills the container, this fills the container. Yeah, seems like all of the values are correct. Let's just try to resize it and make sure that it works as expected, which it does. And that's good. Now I select both of these and I turn this into an auto layout as well. So I wrap everything inside another auto layout and I call this card step 1. All right. Now that I have that, I want to make sure that the width of this layer fills the container. The height can stay fixed. That's perfectly fine. For the content, I want that to fill the container, but I want it to hug the height so that we can be fully responsive. Let's try it out. All right, seems like it works as expected. Perfect. So let's turn this into a component. Command Option K. Now we can see that in this example, we had type 1 and then we had type 2, right? So for this one, for the first set or for the first variation, everything works as expected, which is cool. But now we want to add another variation, and we do that by clicking on this, and then at the very top you have add variant. There's a lot of ways you can go about doing this, but we can just click here, and I would resize this frame a little bit. I usually set an auto layout on this just to make sure that everything sticks to a certain format. For this second variation, then I want the direction of the content to go horizontally instead of vertically stacking. So let's switch the direction here. And now I want this to be 184. And let's make it 184 square. So let's have fixed width. There we go. This should work. This fills the container. The left one, fixed size. However, I need to consider that whenever I shrink this in width, I want to make sure that this image doesn't have a fixed height. I want it to have a height that fills. So let's fill the container instead. And I think we should be good. Perfect. Yeah, this works exactly as expected. Now that we have this one here, we see that it automatically added variant 2. So if we shift this one over to default, then it's the vertical one, and it works just as expected. And now if I switch this over to variant 2, I have this other type of layout. So this is one and the same card component, but it has 2 variations. Let's set a proper name for it. Let's call this orientation, and we call this one vertical and the other one horizontal. We get rid of this baby, and then we make a copy of this just to test it out and see in action. Perfect. We're good to go. So step 1 finished. Let's jump into step 2. So for step 2, we are going to add a Boolean property, and it basically works like this. We see on the right hand side for this example that we have something that says show image, and there's a switch. So for those of you that don't know, Boolean is basically setting a value of a true or false statement, which indicates either the switch being on or off. And in this case, we can turn on and off the property of the image, or the layer visibility of the image. So we basically use the same component here, but we add that specific value for the image, and it's done as follows. If we highlight the image layer here, we can see that there's a setting that has been added. So let me show you exactly how that's done. For the sake of this example, let's make a copy of this component, and we can rename this to automatically set to card step 2. And now let's highlight the image layer, and on the right hand side it says create Boolean property. So when we click on that, it says show image, which we can set to true by default. Set that property, and we do the same here. And now that show image is already created, we can highlight that or select that automatically for this variant as well. So what this means is that once we make an instance of this component, we will see this property show up saying show image, which is turned on by default. But if we switch it off, then what actually happens under the surface is that it takes this layer image and it hides it. Since this is the layer property, what it basically does is it automatically hides it when it's turned off, so to speak. So that's basically how we use the Boolean property for hiding or for showing objects. So for step number 3, we have text value properties. And basically what it means is that for each text, we can add a content property or a text property, which becomes handy on the right hand panel. So when we create an instance of this component, we can see here in the right hand panel that there are 2 slots or 2 areas where you can go ahead and edit each part of the text that's available in the card component. So in this scenario, I've created a text property for the title and the body text. If you want to edit it, you can edit the title and the body text right here. And this is really convenient when you have multiple variations and you want to switch between different ones. The text content will always be the same, and it's easy accessible here on the right hand side instead of you having to dig deep into the layers and edit the text. So it's really convenient. Let's recreate this. We can take our previously created component, turn that into step 3, and now let's add these values. So for content, very similar to the layer property or the Boolean property, we see this icon here, which allows us to create this name. I set that to title, and the value is going to be the default value set for this property. And the same goes for the body content. You can call this body text. And now that those properties have been created, they're going to be available in this list for the second variation. So we can just link them to the same ones. Now that it's linked, we can take one of these instances and we find these options available on the right hand side. Another title, just some body text to show off. There we go. And you can switch between different variations. The copy is still going to be there. That's pretty much it. All right, so the last step for the first section of component properties for this card component is going to be swap instance. So let me show you how this actually works. So we have all of the other things already finished off for this example, but here at the bottom, we see the button component being added. And you see that there's a link here which basically means that when you select the entire variant, you see in the settings that this is linked to an asset. It's linked to that same asset that we saw, that we brought in the examples that we created, but it gives you the possibility to swap between the different variations of that button. So basically in the button components page, we have 3 different buttons, and in the working file we can create, let's recreate this. Here in this example, we can switch or swap instance based off of the settings that we applied. So let's do the same thing for step 4 in our example. So basically we have everything set up just the way we want it, but now the only thing we need to apply is to click on outline, and then we have this one thing called create instance swap property. So click on that button, make sure that we add a relevant title for this property name. Let's call it CTA type. Create property, and the same goes here, CTA type. Now that it's available, then automatically once we create an instance of this component, then we find another option in the right hand panel called CTA type with a drop down menu that's linked to the button components, so you can swap that instance to any of the other buttons that we have available. And that's pretty much it. Now that we have the basics covered, let's dive into the beta features that were released last month. In this example, I'll go over the 2 new features that I find the most value in when designing a card component. So for this first beta feature of component properties, we're going to look at something called exposed nested instances. And what it basically means is that in some cases we create a component that contains multiple subcomponents as well. So in this case, instead of just using an image rectangle, which we did in step 4, as you can see right here, we could create a component called test image in this case, and utilize all of the benefits of actually turning that into a component itself, because we may have different variations of the image that we want to include as part of this master card component. So in this case, we have an example here of test image being nested inside of this master component. So if we take a look at this example, what we can see here is that we have all of the properties included in the master component at the top, and then at the very bottom we see a section called test image, which refers to the component that we have nested inside of this one, and we have all of the properties that are available as part of this subcomponent itself. So only by selecting this master component, we can easily swap between all of the different properties that we have available for the subcomponent as well. So let's make a copy of this one, and then we'll also go ahead and create another copy of this just for the example, and then we can copy card step 4, turn that into step 5. Step 5. All right. Okay. So first things first, let's call this image placeholder. So this is a new component now called image placeholder, and we have all of these 3 different variations. Perfect. And we want this to be nested. So basically what happens now is that I select the rectangle shape, in both of these variations and replace it with the new component. So I'll just copy this one, select the rectangle shape, replace it, and then I'll go ahead and replace this one here as well. And it's gonna come off a little bit odd at first, but we just have to adjust the settings a little bit. So 184 in width, and then we can make sure, instead of having a fixed height, I'd say it's better to have it fill the container. And this means that when I make a copy of it, just like the other example, we can make sure that it's fully responsive. Perfect. Now that we have this right here, we see this error message showing up saying not used within component, and that's because we have replaced the old rectangle shape with this new component. So what we have to do now is to link that with that property. So click on layer, select show image, do the same thing here so that we have that Boolean property, and now that should be functioning perfect for both variations. All right, so this one works. Now that we have that linked, we want to fetch all of the component properties from the image placeholder component. So you click on the plus icon right here, select expose properties from nested instances, and then you select image placeholder. And now when we look on the right hand side, we can find all of the master properties at the top, but we also have a section now for image placeholder that allows us to shift between all of these different properties, as well as the master ones at the top. So for this last feature, we'll get into some advanced stuff. When designing and developing a product, we often create far too many variations of similar components. This takes up way too much time for both development and design maintenance. And therefore, we can use a technique called slots to let the content be dynamic within one and the same component. So in the following example, we'll go over how we can replace the content within the cards with a slot, and how we can use Figma's new component property feature called preferred values. This allows us to handpick which content to suggest for different card types. So here's a really quick breakdown of how slots are used. So for this card, we have an option on the right hand side which says slot. On the left hand side here on the canvas, you can see that I have created multiple pieces of assets that falls under a category called slot. So we have one piece of content, which is the default one. We have another one where we show some kind of a highlight, two informative ones, and then one that basically highlights when something is new. So in this case, for this type of card component, I may only want to display certain number of content slots. In this case, default, the highlight, and the new one. For the informative ones, which are the two other ones, maybe I don't want them to be displayed as a preferred option for this type of card. Now, if I create a different card component that looks and behaves a little bit differently, maybe in this case I want to include only the content options that are relevant for this type of card. So in this case, we have the informative 1 content slot and informative 2 content slot. And with this new component property feature, preferred values, we can select exactly which options that we prefer for certain number of slots. So let me recreate this so you can follow along. So let's start this off by making a copy of this instance just as a reference. We can still keep all of the number of slots that we have available here. We're going to reference these slots or use these slots as part of the working example here. Let's make a copy of step 5, turn that into step 6. And the first thing we're going to do is replace the content pieces that we have inside of the content layer with one of these content slots. So let's copy this one, go inside, and let's paste it in. I'll go ahead and remove the other ones. All right, so we have that available right there. We're gonna just do the same thing for the horizontal piece. All right, now in this case, we can see that title, body text, CTA type, those things have an error sign. We can go ahead and remove those because we're not using that since it's part of the content slot now. And instead, we're gonna highlight slot. We're gonna click on this icon to create an instance swap property. And then we're gonna set some preferred values. And here we can decide exactly what variations we want to include. And in our case, we want to include default, highlight, and new. Let's call this slot. Do the same thing for this one. Link it to the slot property. And now, when we use one of these instances, we can see that we have a vertical, horizontal orientation. We can show and hide the image, and then we have the slot option available, which allows us to select between the preferred values of default, highlight, and new. And then we also have the properties from the image placeholder of gray, gradient, and red. And that's basically it. If we want to enable the text properties and all of the other component properties that we included in the earlier examples, then we want to make sure that those properties are available as part of the separate slots. So this is a little bit of a different way of building up a component that contains content, but it's much easier to manage as part of a design system, and is more of a proper way of designing things that actually aligns with the development environment as well. As you can see, there are many ways to build a card component on Figma. The choice is dependent on the scalability needs of your design project and team. I would love to know how this way of designing differs from what you're already doing today. Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and hit the like button to be the first to know when a new video drops. Catch you in a few. Peace.